The Failure of Necromancy. A Pale Ring short story. Written by Brian McKee. You do not fear me, boy?
Well, I fear you, sir,
Wallace asked, tilting his head at the bars of the small window the voice had come from.
You're not anywhere I can see you, and there's stone and steel between you and me.
I am a criminal in a dungeon cell, the voice countered. Most boys would never even draw close, much less offer to share a bit of bread with me.
Suppose I ain't most boys,
Wallace replied with a non-committal shrug. He held out the basket of bread he'd brought from his father's bakery.
Now, do you want some bread or not?
There was a subtle rustling, the shifting of cloth and the wet slapping of calloused feet on damp stone. A pair of weary, olive-green eyes appeared in the darkness to look back at Wallace. The pale face surrounding those eyes was leathered from many years of squalid conditions. Smears of dirt and grime had accumulated comfortably in the many wrinkles that decorated the man's face. Greasy ropes of black hair framed the eyes, clumped and matted into ropes that almost resembled rotten seaweed. His cheeks lifted in a small smile. I have had nothing but bread and slop to eat since I was jailed, he noted. But to date, none have been fresh. If you are offering me food, far be it from me to turn down a gift. Wallace pulled out a piece of bread, warm and soft, and passed it through the bars. Part of him was expecting the man to snatch it away like a viper, but he took it with gentle fingers and a grateful nod of his head. I thank you, said the prisoner before disappearing back into the darkness. Wallace frowned.
What? Hey! Where are you going?
I'm still here, the prisoner said, his voice farther away now. My legs are weak, you must understand. I shall enjoy your bread, but I shall do so from the floor.
You don't got a stool down there?
Why would I? I am a villain. Villains don't get luxuries. The fact I even have my head is a miracle, to be perfectly honest with you.
So they say,
Wallace mused, scrunching up his face.
I heard that you're a Necromancer.
There was a pause, and then a stifled laugh from the cell. Dear gods, I hope that's not what they call me. No, I'm a necromancer.
That's a funny word.
Good, more to mock me with.
Why ever would I mock you?
There was a brief silence, and the necromancer let off another quiet sigh. You are a strange boy, aren't you?
My mum says I was kicked in the head by a mule when I was 3,
Wallace replied.
Dad says she made that up, and that I'm just different.
I feel your father may have the right of it. You'd likely not be so observant had a mule kicked you at so tender an age, the necromancer noted. May I have the pleasure of knowing your name, young one?
Wallace Barbany.
It is a pleasure to meet you. I am Adantis Monfier. It has been a long time since I've traded words with someone so freely. Wallace Barbany. I thank you for your kindness, but I must ask what it is that brought you to my cell.
Well, see, there's this girl up the road from me, Ophi something, and she and her friends went skulking round here not all that long ago. When they got home, her mama scolded her so loud you'd hear her all the way in the gift. She went on and on, hollering and hooting and being loud. Don't you ever go near that horrible building again, little lass, you hear me? She yelled a bunch. There are evil, horrible people back there, a nectar dancer among them. So I got curious, wanted to come see what all the hubbub was. Heard some of your neighbors whimpering about bad food last time I was here. Thought maybe I'd bring some of my dad's bread, and then you'd talk a bit.
Nectar dancer, Adantis echoed incredulously. You said it that way on purpose.
No, sir, Wallace replied with a shake of his head. It's what I heard at the time. Not my fault the woman don't know a mancer from a dancer.
So you come here and fed me, a convicted criminal, warm bread, out of pure curiosity. Wallace nodded.
Yes, sir. I've never heard of a necromancer before,
he said, taking the foreign word slowly to make sure he had it right.
They say that you cut up corpses. They say you use dark magic to try and commune with darker gods. They say you were trying to raise an army of the dead to do evil work.
And do you believe them, Wallace? Adantis questioned. Wallace shook his head.
No, sir. They'd have killed you if all that were true. People like to yell and make small things sound big.
Keen observation for you to make when you are so young, Adantis pointed out, and Wallace could hear the smile in his voice. You were certainly never hit in the head by a mule. You've a sharp mind, young Wallace, though you are perhaps lacking in good judgment.
I'm 15, sir, Wallace pointed out. Dad says I don't get good judgment till I'm 30.
An arbitrary threshold.
But not without merit,
Adantis muttered to himself.
I dunno what those words mean.
It means it's made up, but it's also right.
Ah.
There was a pause. Wallace tilted his head.
So, what's a necromancer? And why are you in jail for necromancing?
Necromancy, Adantis politely corrected. As for the what and the why, I am afraid that is a very long story, Wallace. And I've no desire to waste your time with long-winded explanations of my follies.
I got more bread.
Wallace tried to entice him.
And I got time.
You do realize if the guards catch you talking to me, they'll run you off with swords drawn, right?
I'm not doing anything wrong,
Wallace countered. You're feeding me.
Feeding people ain't wrong, sir.
There was a long silence as Adantis considered that. Wallace could almost hear him nodding. So be it. I can tell you will not be dissuaded.
Dissuaded?
It means you won't go away unless I tell you what you want to know.
Ah.
Wallace nodded slowly.
Then no, sir. I won't be dissuaded.
Adantis let out an amused huff. Very well. But as I said, it is a long story, so I would urge you to make yourself comfortable. Wallace looked around for anything he could use. There was an old empty barrel nearby. He rolled it over, sat on it, and offered another bit of bread to the bars. Adantis took it and began speaking. Now, where do I begin? He wondered quietly.
With what you did to wind up down there,
Wallace urged him casually.
They said you cut up corpses. Did you?
The word you're looking for is mutilated, Adantis replied. And yes, a lot of them, as a matter of fact.
How come?
Another pause. There was a shifting. I wanted to reanimate them, make them walk again, as the rumors say, Adantis began. But not as you've been told for the purposes of raising an army, nor did I do it for so-called evil work. I wanted to raise the dead to do good work.
What kinds of work?
Wallace tilted his head. The mundane kind. Working the fields of farmlands. Clearing out and maintaining the sewers of big cities. Clearing the debris from disaster sites. Things like that. Various tasks that must be done to keep our civilization turning, but that nobody wants to do. Difficult manual labor.
So you wanted to make slaves?
Wallace could imagine Adantis wincing. I suppose, he conceded.
Wouldn't they rise against you, though?
Wallace pointed out.
That's what most slaves do, isn't it?
That is what tends to happen, yes. Adantis agreed. They're worked to the point of breaking in half. If they do not do the work, then their masters often brutalize them. Eventually, they get tired of it. As you said, they rebel, and they either overthrow their owners or die in the attempt. In either scenario, they become free. But such a revolution is spawned from the impetus of independent thought. Thought is a wonderful thing, and it cannot be controlled. But my zombies, they would have no such independent thought, no will, no burning desire for freedom to inspire the ambition of revolution. Because, moving or not, a corpse is a corpse. Dead is dead. Corpses do not harbor a soul that can experience suffering or sorrow. With a workforce of zombies, there would be no risk of revolution, no risk of inhumane conditions causing misery. The dead do not tire, for they are already asleep, and so would be able to work longer and harder than any living man or woman without breaking from exhaustion. Wallace considered those words for a time, idly nibbling on a piece of bread himself.
I think I understand,
he said after taking a while to work through the necromancer's explanation. There were a lot of words he didn't fully grasp, such as impetus, but he felt he had the basics down.
But why were you messing up bodies to do it?
That is tricky to explain. A dentist sighed. Tell me, how much do you know about magic, young man?
Not much, sir,
Wallace said, glancing up at the sky. It was a clear day, the sun high overhead. Soon enough, it would pass behind the pale ring, the circle of magical stones drifting from one horizon to the other.
Just that it all comes from the pale ring. Rocks fall from it, ring stones, and magi use those to make things happen. Mom says it's a gift from Anuna.
A crude summary, but accurate, Adantis complimented. It is far more complicated than that, however.
I'm not stupid, sir,
Wallace said.
I might not know big words, but you can explain it to me.
There was a few seconds of quiet, and when Adantis spoke next, his voice had softened considerably. A fellow scholarly mind, he whispered. Oh, how I have missed talks like this. Wallace tilted his head.
Huh?
All magic comes from Luma, Adantis explained, shifting back to the topic of magic. Or rather, Luma is magic. The light that the pale ring emits, the silver glow of ring stones, that is Luma. It is raw power, the potential of the universe awaiting instruction. When we magi use magic, we are commanding the Luma of a ringstone to do our bidding. But it is not a limitless resource. A ringstone can only generate so much Luma, and casting spells uses Luma faster than the stone can create it. Eventually, we run out of magic, even with a large stone. And reanimating a corpse? Adantis chuckled weakly. That would take a truly obscene amount of magic, and a vast vocabulary to make it work.
Vocabulary?
Wallace questioned.
What's that?
Your vocabulary is how many words you know, and we magi need many words.
How come?
Do you think the incantations we magi make when casting spells are mere gibberish?
Yeah.
Adantis' chuckle turned into an outright laugh. No, Wallace, no. When we cast spells, we speak in the language of magic. It is a language shared by kobolds and all the other forms of dragonkin. You see, Luma obeys instruction, but not intention. If you do not know the words to explain how a thing happens, then you cannot use magic to make it happen.
Like baking bread,
Wallace said, drawing a comparison to something in his own life.
Dad taught me how to make bread, walked me through it, told me the steps, but he didn't do it for me.
Precisely, Adantis agreed animatedly. In that scenario, You were like his ringstone. You making that bread according to his instructions was similar to how we magi cast our spells.
So, why not just tell a corpse to get up and pick up that bucket?
Wallace questioned. Because it's not that simple, Adantis replied. When giving instructions to Luma, you are not talking to an intelligent consciousness. The language we use for spells is a precise thing, and it is not the subject of our spells that responds to our incantations, but the Luma itself. And Luma does not understand many of the things that we do. For example, bucket. That is a nonsense word to Luma. Get up, likewise, could mean any number of things. No. You must be precise, and precision requires description, and that requires words, and words require Luma, and there is only so much Luma. You understand how that might cause problems?
I think so,
Wallace said, nodding along slowly. To use your example, if I wanted to command a zombie to stand and pick up a bucket, I would need to tell the Luma to force the body to stand. I would have to command each step individually, command the zombie to kneel, command it to move its arms, curl its fingers around the handle, and stand back up. Each would be a different spell. In the time it would take me to do all of that, I could have gone and picked up the bloody bucket myself 15 times. And if the body is too decomposed, it will not be able to follow my instructions in the first place. It would rise and then fall apart into slurry.
That's gross.
It is. I had to witness it a lot. I even tried to enchant the corpses to do as I bid them, and while that proved more useful in some respects, it was far worse in others.
How was it worse?
There were a few seconds of quiet before Adantis' fingers appeared by the bars of his cell again. Before I go on, may I have some more bread? Wallace wordlessly handed him another slice. Adantis withdrew into the shade, nibbled for a few seconds, and then continued. Enchanting is a very long and complicated process, young Wallace. It requires carving runes into something, and filling those runes with the dust you got from a ringstone. You have to recreate those runes in that original ringstone, and the runes have to be perfectly the same, in shape if not size. And they must remain close together, or they will stop working. To make an obedient zombie, I had to take into account just about every conceivable instruction or command it could receive, and know how to respond to each. And again, this is in the language of magic that does not understand our shorthands and expressions.
Sounds like a lot of work.
It was, Adantis said, letting off an exasperated noise. It was like walking through a herd of cattle, slicing 100 of their throats by hand, one by one with an increasingly dull knife. Paragraph upon paragraph of written text, and I had to match it all on one ringstone. A ringstone that was as large as your entire body.
Did it work?
It did, Adantis said, his voice rising with something that sounded like pride. For once, I saw real success. A single zombie, subservient, obedient, capable of following orders. I told it to walk, and it did. I told it to pick up a rock, and it did. It was my greatest achievement. A functional, obedient zombie doing as it was told. There was a pause, and Adantis' voice lowered. But it was slow. It was weak. It was stupid. It did only what I told it, but not always how I wanted. I had to be precise with my orders, or it would not obey correctly. I had to repeat myself for tasks that needed to be done more than once, Or else it would do it once and then stop to gurgle uselessly at me. Again, I found all the same work could be done far easier if I just went and did it myself. And the cost... Adantis sighed wearily. I used one of the largest ring stones I have ever seen. Spent a small fortune on it, enough to buy a house here in Onyxwall. And I used it to make one rotting corpse throw a rock 3 feet. A rotting corpse that would decompose enough to fall apart in a matter of weeks. It was my first success. And it was when I realized that the entire pursuit was doomed from the beginning. It's just not feasible. It takes too much effort and too many resources for even the slightest return. Wallace nodded along slowly.
But why?
He eventually asked.
If it was so bad, why did you try to do it?
Another pause. Another rustling as Adantis shifted his weight around. Tell me, Wallace. Have you ever watched the blacksmith at work? Or watched the farmers tending the fields?
On occasion, sir,
Wallace replied.
It looks hard. I'm glad I get to work in my father's bakery. That's fun.
Count your blessings and pray they persist, Adantis told him soberly. Not all are so lucky as you, and fate is often unkind to those who are. It is hard work, and for some people it is too hard.
What do you mean?
Human bodies are resilient, Adantis said. We're tough, strong. Having cut up so many of the blasted things, I feel confident in that. But we are only comfortable, only happy, when in very specific conditions. For example, you can sit in a cushioned chair for hours and be fine. Albeit a little bored, but if you sit on a wooden plank or a rock, and in time your backside will ache. Adantis let off a tired growl, and his voice dropped even lower. For many people to earn a living, they must work themselves well beyond the threshold of discomfort. They must choose the rock over the cushion.
My dad tells me that honest work is its own reward,
Wallace pointed out with a small frown. I assume he is passionate about baking, then?
Yes, sir.
Then that is good. Hard work given in service to passion is work well done, Adantis said to him. But not everyone loves what they do. And for some, it can be dangerous. Even farmers have risks they face, for example. In spring, bugs bite their flesh and threaten them with disease. In summer, they work long hours in blazing sunlight. They run the risk of heat stroke or dehydration in some climates. In autumn and winter, they may freeze or starve if they did not grow enough food or chop enough wood. And eventually they will die, whether it be of old age or anything else. And when that happens, the people they left behind have to pick up where they left off. There was a pause. When it came again, Adantis' voice was lower than ever. Such was the fate of my father.
Your father's dead?
Wallace echoed in surprise. He is. Died when I was young, Adantis confirmed. He worked himself to death, trying to support my mother and I. When he was gone, we had to pick up the pieces and do the work he no longer could. And she suffered for it. Nearly followed my father into the grave.
And that's why you wanted the zombies?
Wallace wondered.
So your mum wouldn't have to do so much work?
Oh, my mother is long dead as well, Adantis corrected. She died 6 years ago in the Plague of Threen. You've heard of that, yes?
Yes, sir.
Well, It was no random outbreak, I should point out. It was caused when a band of green-scale kobolds with no hoard decided to poison the town's wells and water towers. They threw in rats that had contracted some disease from the world below. Nearly half the town was infected, and only a few of the infected survived. Wallace shuddered, curling in on himself.
That's awful, sir. Why would the kobolds do that?
Who knows? The dentist asked. They're green scales, remnants of the horde that followed the green dragon Azada. She wished nothing more than to see our entire species eradicated. Maybe this act of sabotage from the kobolds was an attempt at revenge. Who can say?
And your mother died in that?
A lot of people did. Not just my mother. Adantis confirmed quietly.
So, Threen was your hometown?
It was, Adantis confirmed. Pleasant place. But as I said, nearly half the town was killed by the poisoning. I was away when it started, studying magic in Underbridge. When I came home, the disaster was at its worst. The cause was found not long after, and while the garrison dealt with the kobolds, I used my magic to purify the wells and water towers, and enchant them against further sabotage. The survivors were saved.
I heard about that too,
Wallace exclaimed, sitting up. He had known a mage had been the one to save the neighboring city, but he had never heard the name.
You're a hero then.
To a small handful of people, perhaps I am. Adantis shrugged. I was certainly thanked for my work countering the poison. But many people still died. I remember, when I was little, I would look out at the fields around the town. I would see the farmers ambling between shocks of corn and budding potatoes. I would see men and women walking up and down the lanes of trees in the apple orchards, arms hooked through baskets, filling them with food. It wasn't easy work, but there were many, and the burden was shared. And then, after the poisoning,
it got harder.
Wallace finished for him. Much harder, Adantis confirmed. I will consider it a miracle if Threen reclaims even half of her old glory in your lifetime. The Count there does good work, but there's only so much he can do when there are so few people left to do the work of the many. Wallace passed another bit of bread into the bars.
And that's what made you want to make the zombies?
Well, that's where the idea began, at least, Adantis confirmed. I knew such works would be frowned upon. But I thought, if the dead, having given their permission in life, could still be made to carry on working, then maybe they could help ease the burdens of the living. Those with lives still to live would have more time to pursue their passions and ambitions, the things that make their lives worth living. For your father, perhaps it is baking. For my mother, it would have been dancing. For another man, horse racing, so on and so forth. For me, magic. Adantis let off a quiet sigh. But, well, such a project required corpses. There were plenty to be found around here for a time. There were problems with raiding parties and bandits in the swamps around Onyxwall. I'm sure you recall that.
Aye, sir. Band of mercenaries came through and killed them all. I was real young, though. Don't remember it too well.
I joined those mercenaries, lent my magic to the cause. And all I asked in return was a small share of the payout and access to the bodies.
They let you do that?
I told them it was for physiological research, which technically was not a lie. Wallace frowned.
Physio what?
The study of bodies and how they function.
Ah.
I spent a long time working on those bodies. Adantis went on. Made some small progress, but it was mostly trial and error. And I was not working in the best conditions. There was nowhere in the city that would allow me to conduct such gruesome work, so I had to improvise. Luckily, the bandits had used an old abandoned fortress as their base of operations. With them gone and the Count not having any use for it, I took that as my invitation to move in. Even so, it was a ruin. You can imagine that made life rather hard.
I can imagine,
Wallace agreed.
Had a bit of a draft, didn't it?
To put it mildly. Adantis chuckled before his tone darkened again. Sadly, I eventually ran out of bodies. I tried to get more by taking away those who were recently executed, but that was an unreliable supply. So, eventually, I committed the primary crime that has me behind bars. I slunk through the smaller towns and villages around Onyxwall, and I stole away with the corpses of their recently deceased.
Wallace shifted away from the window somewhat. You didn't kill anyone yourself, did you?
No, Adantis said immediately and emphatically. My goals were to use those who were dead already to make the lives of the living easier, not create more dead.
Wallace nodded along quietly. I see.
Adantis sighed, and Wallace could imagine him shaking his head. In the end, as I said, when I was finally met with success, I realized just how much I had to put into it, and just how little I got out of it. Killing 100 cows by hand. For one strawberry.
So what did you do?
The only thing I could think to do. I resold my unused ring stones and used the money to buy a small home here in Onyxwall. I'd kept extensive notes on my work, as all good researchers do, and in that house I compiled my notes and all of my retrospective revelations into a book. I had copies made and sent to every assemblage chapter I could think of. Then I turned myself in, and here I am. My notes, compliance, forthrightness, and the fact I gave myself up willingly all spared my life. But I will never walk freely again.
Doesn't that bother you?
Wallace wondered.
Most people don't like being in prison.
It is not pleasant, Adantis agreed quietly. But it is just. I committed numerous crimes in my pursuit of an impossible solution. Whatever good may have come of my research does not absolve me of the sins I committed. Maybe one day someone will find a way to solve the problems I tackled, and they will do so without violating laws or sacrificing their morals to do it. I robbed graves, Wallace. I desecrated corpses. I was also squatting in a ruin that was technically still the property of the city, even if no one was using it.
Wallace nodded along. So you're just going to stay there?
He asked. It is the price I am to pay for my foolishness. Adantis replied easily. If ever I am released, I'll make the most of that freedom. But if I am to rot here in this cell, then so be it. Either way, I am confident that the souls of all those I experimented on will have words for me when I too am dead. Whatever the case, my work is done, and I find I have no other ambitions that these walls can hinder.
Wallace nodded along. It was a grim story, to be sure, and he could see why so many people would treat this man with such loathing and contempt. But through the entire conversation, he couldn't find it in him to be afraid of the imprisoned necromancer, or even think ill of him. Not much, at least. The man had admitted what he had done was wrong, and was accepting his punishment with dignity and grace.
If nothing else, Wallace could respect that much about him.
I have told you my story,
Adantis suddenly said, drawing Wallace's attention.
May I now ask you a question of my own?
Wallace frowned.
I suppose so,
he said.
What is it?
Do you believe that I am a bad person? Do you believe that my work was wrong? Wallace frowned deeper.
I don't know. You said it was wrong, didn't you?
The robbing of graves, yes, and the desecrating of corpses, Adantis confirmed. Such sins I will forever carry. But it was all in service to what I believe was a good end. I could not reach it, but not for a lack of trying, and I like to think good things did come of my research. I had to find ways to preserve the bodies I was working with. I had to find ways to repair ones that had lost limbs. And all of it was in the notes I sent to the assemblage. Perhaps someone else could take that work and make advances in medicine. Severed limbs could be reattached to living people. Amputation could be a thing of the past. Meat could be stored for longer, making food supplies more reliable. Not as many people would go hungry. His face appeared in the bars of the cell again. But all of those discoveries came because I robbed graves and mutilated the bodies of the dead. Does that mean that the good things I learned are no longer worthy of use? Are my good discoveries tainted by my evil deeds? At what point does a man's evil discount whatever good he has done? At what point must it all be thrown away? Is there such a point? Wallace looked down at the ground, thinking.
I don't think I know enough to answer that, sir,
he finally said.
You do not have to,
Adantis assured him.
Not right now. But I would ask you to keep those questions in the back of your mind. It need not be a pursuit, but from time to time, just consider them. Weigh them. Think on them as you might think about how much flour you need for your next loaf of bread. What do you believe?
Wallace asked.
You've been in that cell a long time, haven't you? Had a lot of time to think on it yourself.
And for all that time, I find I have no answer, Adantis confessed. I am naturally obligated to say that my good works should stand apart from my evil ones, but I am also biased. These are my works, and I spent many years on them. I cannot be trusted to be fair and honest in my moral assessments. Whatever answers I come to would inevitably be flawed. Maybe your answer would likewise be flawed, but for reasons that are more honest than my own. Wallace hummed quietly. His eyes wandered. They eventually landed on his basket, and he found he had 2 slices of bread left. Smiling softly, he extracted them and held them to the bars.
I don't know that I'll ever find an answer, sir,
he said.
I don't know that anyone will. But thank you for telling me your story.
No, young man, Adantis said, accepting the bread. Thank you for hearing it, and for the bread. The two sat in quiet for a short time. Eventually, Wallace looked up at the sky and frowned. The sun was starting to pass behind the ring, plunging the world into the dark shades of short night. He'd been gone for too long.
I need to be going now, sir,
he said, standing up.
Mom and Dad are going to be worrying about me.
What will you tell them?
That I was chasing a mule.
Adantis laughed merrily at that. Ha! Probably a less worrying activity than trading words with the Necromancer. But this has been enjoyable, Wallace. And it is my hope that you have learned something. Even if you didn't, again, I thank you.
You're welcome, sir. I can bring you more bread sometime if you'd like.
No. That won't be necessary, Adantis assured him. Goodbye, Wallace.
Oh. All right.
Wallace frowned. A second later, he bowed his head.
Goodbye, sir.
With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the streets of Onyxwall. Adantis watched him leave, then sat down with his back to the cold stone wall of his cell. He looked down at the final piece of bread held between his muck-smothered fingers. It was soggy now, shrinking in his grasp. He wondered for a moment if it was ruined, or if the memory of what it had been was enough to make it wonderful. With a smile, he bit down into it.